Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Daria, and I'm a host at Focus Space. Before we jump in, I wanted to give a few housekeeping things and reminders. So, first, please note that this workshop is being recorded, but your faces and names will not appear in the recording, even if your video is turned on. So, feel free to have video on and engage. A copy of this recording will be sent out afterwards. And then due to the significant amount of people we're expecting, we ask everyone to remain on mute. But if you do have questions, feel free to share them in the chat, and Whitley will do her best to kind of answer them either at the end or throughout. Okay, and with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. For those who are new, just a quick intro. Focus Space is a virtual co-working community that hosts daily, weekly, and monthly planning sessions, as well as events such as these. We're kind of like a gym for getting stuff done. So if you're curious to know more about us, and you're not a member or not part of the community yet, I've just pasted a link in the chat where you can get a free month and check us out. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's workshop. We're here with Dr. Whitley Lassen. She's a licensed clinical psychologist based out of Boulder, Colorado, with over 15 years of experience specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, but also worries, phobias, and panic attacks. Her goal is to empower her clients to live without limitations through a combination of compassionate support and a direct approach. So we're really excited to have you here, Whitley. I'll pass it off to you to get us started.
Thanks so much, Daria. And hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you all today and to get the chance to be part of this community. My goal today is to help you learn something new, whether that's a new fact about anxiety or a new practical skill or tip that you can walk away from today. So I'm really excited to dig in and we can go ahead and just get started. Daria, can you show the next slide? So here's our outline for today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety so you can get a better sense of what anxiety is all about. We'll talk about CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy approach to anxiety. We'll go into some practical strategies, and we are going to practice these today together. We'll touch on lifestyle modifications when you have anxiety, and then leave some time at the end for Q&A. Next slide, Daria. So I'm sure we all have lots of different ideas about what anxiety is, and I think it's important just to start off by naming that anxiety is normal. It is a normal and often helpful emotion that alerts us to potential dangerous situations. So, one example is, anxiety is a natural response to stress that can sometimes be helpful. For example, if you're feeling anxious before an important exam or before a big meeting at work, anxiety can motivate you to study or prepare or prep your presentation thoroughly, which can actually improve your performance. So, anxiety can be helpful to a certain point. Another example of when anxiety is helpful is if you're anxious about crossing a busy street. Anxiety may actually help you be more alert and cautious and help you stay safe. Make sure you look both ways and you're really aware of what's going on in your surroundings. So it's really just our body's way of signaling that we need to pay attention and take action. But anxiety can become overwhelming, and our fight or flight response can basically trigger us to have too much anxiety in situations when it's not actually really helpful, where it doesn't add that value or help us stay safe. So it is helpful to differentiate normal anxiety, which is and can sometimes be just an emotion, versus an anxiety disorder. So, normal anxiety is a natural response to stress or potential danger, but when anxiety becomes overwhelming or starts to interfere with your daily life, that's when it might be a sign that you may have an anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive and persistent fear or worry, panic attacks, and it's usually at a level where your anxiety doesn't match the situation that you're in. So, Daria, if you can share the next slide, I'll go through some examples. So, there are a lot of different anxiety disorders, and we're not going to have time to cover all of them today. But generalized anxiety disorder is when you have chronic and exaggerated worry. Think about it as if, like, your brain is tuned to the worry radio station, and it's just like worry, worry, worry all the time, nonstop. If you have generalized anxiety disorder, it can be really hard to shut off those worries or to even push the worries aside and concentrate on anything that you need to get done. Usually, when um, we're worriers, we can spend a lot of time thinking about the worst case scenario. And even when there's not really a reason for concern, our worried brain can kind of just make us think about the worst over and over and over again. So it's really all about being a worrier. Panic disorder is when you have panic attacks that can happen all of a sudden, out of the blue, sometimes for no apparent reason. A panic attack includes usually like an intense surge of fear and feelings of impending doom. And with that fear, you can have a variety of physical sensations, including heart palpitations, getting sweaty, shaky, feeling like you can't breathe, feeling hot or cold. Stomach upset is another common symptom. And if you are afraid of the panic attacks or you worry about having another panic attack, then you could be experiencing panic disorder. The last anxiety disorder I'll talk about today are specific phobias. The specific phobias involve when you have intense and irrational fear of specific objects or situations. Some common phobias are like fear of heights, fear of flying, fear of dogs. Um, and these phobias, as with the other anxiety disorders, usually the fear and the anxiety doesn't match the actual danger posed in the situation. So these are just a couple of anxiety disorders. If you think these might describe you, then you're definitely in the right place. We're going to talk about some tips for managing anxiety, but certainly also working with a therapist can definitely help. Okay, next slide, Daria. So anxiety usually involves three different kinds of symptoms. A lot of us really think of anxiety and we think of the physical symptoms. So, like I mentioned earlier, some of the sensations you could have when you're having a panic attack. But anxiety also does impact us cognitively. So, if you're experiencing anxiety, you could be worrying about the spider that's in your closet, or you could be worrying about everything all day long, all the time. So there's the physical, the cognitive, and then importantly, the behavioral component to anxiety. So, anxiety is going to want to make you avoid the things that you're afraid of, and sometimes the things that trigger your anxiety as well. So, it might make you avoid specific situations, specific thoughts, or even specific physical sensations because having those thoughts or sensations or being in those situations make your anxiety worse. So, with avoidance, avoidance is something that can help you feel better short term in the moment, but avoiding things that you're afraid of or that cause anxiety actually is going to make you more anxious the next time that you're in a situation where those things are present, and it will keep your anxiety going in the long run. So, avoidance is one of those behaviors that we want to work on changing. And when we get to the CBT approach, we'll talk more about that. Next slide, Daria. Okay, so there are some common causes for anxiety. So there are biological factors, things like genetics, neurotransmitters, and brain chemistry that can all really just influence your specific likelihood of getting anxious. Just because you have some of these factors doesn't mean you'll always be anxious, but it does mean that you may have to have a better set of tools and coping strategies to deal with anxiety than someone who maybe doesn't have a genetic predisposition. Certainly, environmental factors can also cause anxiety. So, stress, if we have a lot of stress in our life and we're not particularly doing a good job of managing stress, that can certainly trigger anxiety. Um, Traumatic, scary, or dangerous situations can also become a trigger. If you've had some of these situations, your brain might learn all situations like this are dangerous and will trigger anxiety when you're in similar situations. Life changes can also cause anxiety, even if they're positive life changes. So, getting married, starting a new job, having a baby, these things are all really positive and exciting, but they can still trigger some anxiety just because of the change itself. And lastly, there are different psychological factors that contribute to anxiety. Certainly, that negative thinking pattern that we spoke about a little bit earlier. If you're always thinking about the worst case scenario, you're always thinking about the negative, it can make it more likely that you'll stay focused on worrying and thinking about the future. And then on the other hand, if you're someone that has really, really high expectations of yourself, if you're an overachiever, sometimes if you can't meet those expectations or if you make a mistake, that can trigger anxiety as well. So it's helpful to just know what some of your triggers might be because you can work on changing some of them. Okay, next slide, Daria. Okay, so pause for a reflection question. What symptoms of anxiety are you experiencing? I saw someone said inability to concentrate or focus. That is definitely a very, very common one. There is a lot of overlap with concentration and focus difficulty in people who are experiencing anxiety, as well as for people who are experiencing ADHD. Yep, and anxiety can definitely make it hard to fall asleep because our mind is just going worry, worry, worry. And it can impact us in so many different ways. So, the good news is that anxiety, while uncomfortable, is not dangerous and is not harmful. And there are strategies that can help to manage some of these symptoms so that you can have a life free from limitations where the anxiety doesn't take control over you. So let's talk about ways to manage anxiety next. Next slide. Oh, okay. We're going to talk about CBT first. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about CBT. CBT is a structured and time limited therapy approach that is goal focused and goal oriented. So it's different than um, traditional therapy or relational therapy where you go and you talk to your therapist and they just listen. CBT is a collaborative approach to therapy where you'll work with a therapist to understand the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And particularly when we think about anxiety, anxiety is the feeling, or fear is the feeling. And we want to work on changing some of those unhelpful thoughts. So, the worries that just keep going and keep us up at night, the intrusive thoughts that are just repetitive, the thoughts about the worst case scenario that may not really be totally based on the reality of the situation. They may be more intense and maybe a little bit disproportionate. So we want to work on changing thoughts. And then in CBT, we also want to work on changing behaviors. And one of the big behaviors we talked about already in terms of anxiety is that avoidance. Avoidance might make you feel better in that moment, but over the long term, it's just going to make your anxiety worse. So when you work with a CBT therapist, you'll be focusing on changing thoughts and behaviors. This is mostly because feelings are a normal part of life. They're a natural emotional response that we have, and everybody has feelings. So you're allowed to have whatever feelings you have. Your feelings are valid, and we don't want to take away from those feelings. We don't want you to not feel at all. So instead, in CBT, we work on changing your thoughts and your behaviors so that we can decrease the intensity and the frequency of the feelings. So you're still going to have feelings when you're anxious, but we're going to work on reducing how much they impact you. Okay, next slide, Daria. Okay, so thinking about how anxiety is showing up for you right now, what do you want to work on changing first? Thoughts, your anxious thoughts, or the behaviors that are fueling your anxiety or keeping anxiety going? I'm seeing a mix definitely of thoughts and behaviors. And I think it is important to point out, like somebody said, they are definitely connected, thoughts and behaviors, and they are both hard to change. But with some structured tools, and particularly using a CBT approach, you can effectively learn how to change your thoughts and your behaviors. So let's talk about some of those practical strategies now. Okay, so here we're going to be focusing on the cognitive in CBT, so the thoughts. So this is a great strategy to start with. The three C's of CBT are really focused on catching, checking, and challenging your thoughts. So, catching means to become aware or to notice your anxious thoughts as they occur. It involves pausing in the moment, noticing, and labeling that thought as negative or unhelpful. So, you don't have to put this in the chat, but I want everyone to take a few minutes and just think about, and if you have a piece of paper, write down a specific thought that you had that was an anxious thought. Maybe there was a stressful situation or a moment where anxiety got spiked. and you felt anxious, what was one thought that came to your mind? So give folks a few minutes to think about that. And in this step of catch, we're just writing down the thoughts. We're just catching them or noticing them. So if you're still thinking of a thought, take your time. But we're gonna move on and talk about once you've caught that thought, what you do next. So the next step is to check. So you want to check your thought to examine the evidence for and against that anxious thought. So what we're doing here is we're evaluating whether the thought is based on facts. So here you'll take your thought and you'll make a list of all the facts and evidence that agree with your thought. And then in a different column, you'll make a list of all the facts and evidence that is against or disagrees with your thought. So you may ask yourself questions like, what evidence do I have that supports this thought? And what evidence do I have that contradicts it? I'm going to talk about challenging thoughts, and then I'm going to show everybody an example of how to do this. So bear with me if you're still thinking of facts and evidence. You can come back to that in a few moments. So the third step here is to challenge. So when we're talking about challenging thoughts, that really means questioning the validity of the anxious thought and considering an alternative or more balanced perspective. Keeping in mind that our anxious thoughts are usually focused on the worst case scenario, we're usually focused on the negative and really focused on a bad outcome. Now, in step two, in check, you've actually collected the evidence and the evidence that shows that maybe your thought is true or maybe your thought is not true. So you'll use that evidence to now challenge your thought. So, is my thought realistic? Is my thought based on the facts? And if it's not, based on the facts that you found in checking your thought, what is a more balanced thought that you can replace your anxious thought with? So I think it'll be most helpful to go through an example of this together. So Daria, if you could move the next slide. Okay, so how many of you have ever had a panic attack before and you've had the thought, I'm gonna pass out? This is actually a really, really common fear thought that people have when they're having panic attacks. So I'm gonna pass out is the thought. Now let's check some facts to see, is our fear thought true or is our fear thought untrue? So some facts. It's true that dizziness and lightheadedness are common symptoms of having a panic attack, but when you pass out, it's because your blood pressure is low and you pass out so that you'll be uh, horizontal and it'll be easier for your heart to pump blood to your brain. However, when you're having a panic attack, usually your blood pressure is actually high. Your blood pressure tends to be high when you're having a panic attack because your heart is beating really fast, because it's trying to pump more blood to your major fighting muscles. A panic attack is when the fight or flight response has been triggered and it's trying to get your body ready to fight or run away from a danger. So when you pass out, it's because your blood pressure is low, but when you're having a panic attack, it's because your blood pressure, sorry, when you're having a panic attack, your blood pressure is high. So people almost never pass out from a panic attack itself. There are other reasons that you can pass out, right? For example, if your blood sugar is low or if you are dehydrated, but those are not things that are caused from a panic attack itself. So, another fact is fear of passing out is a really common fear that people have when they're panicking because they have this sensation of dizziness, they feel lightheaded, and they're afraid, right? So, it's really, really common to have that fear. But having that fear doesn't mean it's actually going to come true. So, another fact to think about here, and this is an example from one of my clients I work with. She said, well, actually, I've had 30 panic attacks in my life and I've never passed out. So, that's a fact that says, maybe my fear of passing out isn't actually true because I've actually had panic attacks 30 times and I've never passed out from one. So, we started with our thought, I'm going to pass out. Then we check the facts. In this case, all of the facts really say that our fear is not likely to come true, right? The facts don't agree with the fear that we're going to pass out. So when we think about challenging our thoughts and coming up with a more balanced perspective that is based on the facts and the evidence, one example of a balanced thought, instead of saying to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm going to pass out, I'm going to pass out, it would be more helpful because it's more based on the facts to say, okay, just because I'm feeling dizzy, it doesn't mean I'll pass out. It's most likely that these sensations will fade when the panic stops. This is just a feeling. Dizziness is just a sensation. And my thought is just a fear. It's not based on the facts. And when we stop and we look at the facts and the evidence, then we have an opportunity to start to challenge our thoughts. And this is where we can really start to change our thoughts so that they're not stuck in this anxiety and fear based thinking. So I know we just covered a lot in a really short time, but this is a really key strategy for changing your thoughts. First, catch the unhelpful or anxious thought. Check for facts to see, is your thought based in the facts and the evidence, or is your thought really just an anxious thought that's coming from the anxious part of your brain that is overly focused on the worst case scenario? And lastly, take those facts that you discovered and work on challenging that thought by coming up with a balanced perspective so that the next time you have that thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to pass out, you can replace it with this balanced thought by repeating the balanced thought to yourself. Now, this is hard work. It does take practice. But over time, what happens is this can become something that you can do automatically as soon as you have that anxious thought. And that can really help decrease the amount of time spent you're spending on your thoughts and your worries. I hope this is a helpful strategy. Again, this is focused on the cognitive. We're going to move to some other strategies here next. But before we do, I'll pause and see if anyone has questions about this activity.
There was one question that popped up in the chat, Whitley. It's from Trina, and we had a few people kind of weigh in on their personal experiences with panic attacks. But she said, "When I have a panic attack and struggle to breathe, water helps me calm down. Is this normal?"
Yeah, so feeling like you're not getting enough air or feeling like you can't breathe is a common fear that people have when they're having a panic attack. The good news, Trina, is that you are breathing and you are getting enough oxygen. One of the reasons why you might feel like you're not getting enough air is because there's a slight change in the ratio of oxygen and carbon dioxide that happens when you're having a panic attack, and that can lead to that feeling. Um, Drinking water, certainly if that helps you, I would say continue doing that. Some other things that can help, I saw in the chat we're going to talk about here next are grounding techniques or deep breathing, just to help you stay more focused on the moment, because it's really easy when we have a panic attack to pay a lot of attention to our sensations and to start to become afraid of the sensations themselves, even. And so I would say whatever works for you, drinking water, if that works for you, absolutely keep doing it. We're going to talk next about some other strategies that can help when you're having a panic attack. And it's important to keep in mind that different things are going to work for different people. So keep an open mind as you're hearing these strategies, but also if you already have something that works for you, I would say keep doing it. Thanks for that question, Daria. Let's keep moving forward. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about thoughts and we talked about working on changing our thoughts with the cognitive strategy. Now we're going to talk more about behaviors and how to work on changing your behaviors. So um, you can go to the next slide, actually, Daria. So we're going to talk first about gradual exposure. And gradual exposure is really important because it gives you the opportunity to stop avoiding and to start facing your fears in a gradual way so that your brain can learn, one, that it's okay to be anxious because exposure will usually make you a little bit more anxious while you're doing it the first time. But also, it helps your brain learn that the feared situation is not actually dangerous. So let's work together now to spend a few minutes to create a fear hierarchy. If you have a phobia and you're afraid of something, creating a fear hierarchy is a way to create kind of like a ladder for yourself, if you can imagine it, where you would start by putting something that is the least scary on the lowest ladder, lowest rung of the ladder. And then at the top of your hierarchy would be like the most scary thing. So along the way, you'll rate each item on your hierarchy from 0 to 100, rating them from least scary to most scary. Um, Daria, if you can move the slide forward, I have an example of what a fear hierarchy would look like. So if you're someone who is afraid of birds, this could be maybe what your fear hierarchy looks like. And certainly if you're not ready to gradually face your fears on your own, this is something that you can do with a therapist, particularly with a therapist who specializes in CBT and exposure therapy. But if you look at this hierarchy, the first thing on the list is talking about birds. And the person who made this hierarchy rated talking about birds as a 10 out of 100 in terms of how anxiety provoking that is. And you can see on this list from items 1 to 10, each of the items get more scary because the um, level of anxiety the person rated it went up and up and up. So, talking about birds was least scary. Watching videos of geese was maybe like a 50, so moderately scary. And then touching or feeding a duck was the most scary thing that this person could think about on their hierarchy. So if you are afraid of something different, it's not birds, it could be a different kind of animal. Um, Blood or needles are very common phobias, heights, um, enclosed situations, um, flying. You could replace birds here with situations related to your fear and start with something that is least scary and gradually work up to facing your fear of the most scary thing. Now, when you do start to face your fear, your anxiety will go up, it will peak, and then it will come back down. And so that the first time you talk about birds, your anxiety might get to a 90 out of 100, or it might only be a 10 out of 100. But the next time you talk about birds, your anxiety will still go up, but the peak will be less intense, and then it will go back down. And you would keep working on talking about birds until you can do it with no anxiety at all. And then at that point, that would be when you would move to the next thing on your hierarchy, which is a little bit more scary than talking about birds. In this example, it's looking at pictures of birds. So you want to master the thing that's least scary first, and then work up to the things that are a little bit more scarier over and over again. So this is something that is proven to work for phobias and fears in particular, and it's something that is really hard to do. So if you're ready to face your fears, you can try it out on your own, but certainly the support of a therapist to walk you through this kind of approach can only add extra value. Um, Okay, so this is a behavioral strategy for gradually and slowly facing your fears. Let's talk about a couple other behavioral strategies next. If Daria, you can move this up forward. Okay, so I think I saw someone mention this in the chat already, but when you're feeling anxious or when you're panicking, grounding techniques can be super, super helpful. Grounding is a mindfulness technique that can really just help you stay in the present moment. What I like about it for anxiety in particular is that anxiety can make you think about the future. And for some people, when they have a panic attack, they can even feel a little bit disconnected from their body or a little bit like they're not sure if what they're experiencing is actually real. So, grounding techniques can help bring you back to the moment. So, grounding there are a lot of different ways that you can do grounding, but one really easy way that I think is easy to remember is called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So to do this, you would, and we can do this together here in a moment. You would name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So let's just take a moment, just get into a comfortable position, take a deep breath or two, and start to notice your surroundings in the room that you're in. And say out loud to yourself 5 things that you can see. Now, for things that you can touch, and actually take a moment to touch those things. Notice three things you can hear, two things you can smell, and one thing you can taste. And take a moment, and I want to ask you again the question that Daria asked in the beginning. How is your anxiety right now on a scale of 1 to 10? What did you notice after taking those few minutes to do some grounding? I see some people saying it's lower, and it, this is just a great, quick little technique you can do to bring you back to the moment, to get you in touch with your surroundings, and to get a break from thinking about the future and instead focusing on the present. So that's grounding techniques. There are lots of different ways that you can do that. That is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. Um, Sometimes I think it's helpful when we're doing grounding to actually like put both feet on the floor, maybe even lay on the ground, but really just to connect with what is in your environment using all five of your senses. So, relaxation techniques are similar to grounding, but relaxation strategies can also help to bring down your overall level of anxiety. Um, One of the reasons that deep breathing works, that's the relaxation strategy we're going to do next, is because when you're anxious and when the fight or flight response gets triggered, that activates the sympathetic part of your nervous system. And when we're breathing, particularly when we're breathing into our belly and doing what's called diaphragmatic breathing, that actually activates the parasympathetic part of our nervous system. And that's the part of our nervous system that is responsible for us relaxing, calming down, and even going to sleep. So let's try a quick breathing exercise together today. I'm going to ask everybody to sit in a comfortable position and put a hand on your chest and put the other hand on your belly. Now, take a few deep breaths at your own pace and depth, and then just breathe normally. Just find a natural rhythm of breathing for you. I'm going to explain how we're going to do this type of deep breathing, but keep breathing normally while I'm explaining. So, the next time I ask you to take a deep breath, what I want you to do is focus on breathing in so that your belly fills with air like a balloon. So you should feel the hand on your belly rise when you breathe in. And then when you breathe out, imagine all that air deflating from the balloon. You should feel the hand on your belly fall. The hand on your chest should not really move too much because we want to be focused on breathing in and out of our belly. So let's practice that together. You can go at your own pace, but I'm going to count to 4 as I breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause and then breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And breathing in again, filling my belly with air like a balloon. And then breathe out, releasing all of that air from my belly. Take a few breaths like this on your own. If you notice that your hand on your chest is moving, just pause and reset and try again to focus on breathing into your belly. I'm going to ask everybody, wherever they're at, to take one more round of deep breaths, breathing into their belly. Pause and breathe out. So go ahead and breathe normally. You can continue practicing breathing deeply into your belly if you want, or you can find your natural rhythm of breathing. But how did that feel? What do you notice? How is your anxiety now on a scale of 1 to 10? Daria almost fell asleep. Yep, well, that means it was working. You were doing it right, Daria. Yep. If you got sleepy or feel more relaxed, then you are definitely activating that parasympathetic nervous system. And that is just what you want to help you feel calm. One of the great ways to practice this kind of breathing is to actually do it lying down and put a book on top of your belly and then put your hand on top of that book. That way you can really see that your hand rising and falling and your belly rising and falling as you're breathing in and out. So one easy way to remember this type of breathing, I like to call it 4x4 breathing. So the idea is you would practice it for 4 minutes, count to 4 when you breathe in, count to 4 when you breathe out, and do it 4 times a day. Now, it's ideal to practice this 4 times a day when you're not anxious at first, so that you can really get good at building up this skill and you can get really good at deep breathing. That will only make it that much easier to use in those moments where you are feeling anxious. So, we talked about grounding techniques, we talked about deep breathing. So, hopefully, you have some ideas for how to change your thoughts and how to change your behaviors to help reduce your anxiety. You can move to the next slide, Daria. So, take a moment and think about what of these things will you practice on your own at home? What resonated the most for you? I see some people liked the breathing and the grounding. That is great. Okay. In the interest of time, I'd like to keep us going, but keep putting your answers in them. Keep putting your answers in the chat. I'm so curious to learn. Okay, so when we are dealing with anxiety on a regular basis, in addition to these strategies that we talked about already, there are a couple of just practical lifestyle things that can help. So, um, definitely exercise is a really great tool for anxiety. So, if you can develop a routine and get your body moving and get some regular physical activity, that is a great way to burn off that adrenaline and those physical sensations that often come with anxiety. And it doesn't matter what kind of exercise, it could be stretching or walking or lifting weights or swimming or doing CrossFit. Anything that gets you moving can help to release some of that anxiety stored in your body. It's also important to know from a nutrition perspective, um, with anxiety, both alcohol, marijuana, and caffeine can all actually make anxiety worse. So, if you are already feeling anxious, it may be good to think about limiting some of these substances just because they do tend to trigger anxiety for a lot of people. Um, Sleep is definitely important. Most adults need 6 to 9 hours of sleep at night. And I know anxiety can get in the way. If you're interested for some tips on sleep and anxiety, feel free to reach out to me after the presentation, and I can give you a couple of pointers there. Lastly, it's hard dealing with anxiety every day, and it's really important that you have a support network and people who you can talk to about how you're feeling. So, don't hesitate to reach out to those friends and family in your network who will be supportive for you. Um, okay, next slide, Daria. Okay, so we have time for maybe one or two questions before we wrap up today. Daria, any questions in the chat that stand out to you?
Yeah, we had a question from Rachel who actually had to leave, but a few people kind of seconded it. She said she's curious how CBT addresses when anxiety is based on something true. So, in parentheses, for her, tasks do take too long or get more complicated than they should be because she says, I'm disorganized and I do complete tasks late or drop the ball. So, and that leads her to feeling more avoidance. So, yeah, how might that CBT address something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I gave the example in catch, checking in, challenging, all the facts in my example said the fear wasn't true. But sometimes there are facts that say your fear is true. If your fear agrees with the facts, then that means you do have a real life problem. And maybe it's dropping the ball or taking too long to get done with tasks. With CBT, how CBT would approach that is to say, okay, if you have a problem, then we need to come up with a concrete plan and some coping strategies for what are you going to do to deal with that problem. So maybe if you know that it takes you extra time to do tasks, you have to schedule extra time or ask for extra time in advance or really plan out, okay, I need 4 hours to get this task done. I'm going to schedule it in my calendar so I can make sure I have enough time to get this done. So CBT is all about coming up with realistic plans when there are real life problems that come up. I think I have time for one more question before we need to think about wrapping up.
Yeah, well, Justin had one um, about he said, sometimes I end up looking for facts on WebMD, and this generally doesn't make me feel better. Any guidelines for how to be fair and balanced in the check phase?
Yes, absolutely. Great point. Justin, you are not alone. So many people, especially if you're warriors, tend to go to WebMD to search for facts. But I would recommend not looking at WebMD because when you're looking at WebMD, your brain is going to go to the worst case scenario. So let's say you have a headache and you're looking up what could cause headaches on WebMD, there's probably a list of like 10 things that could cause headaches, including dehydration. But your brain is going to go to, oh, brain tumor. That's it. I definitely have a brain tumor. So try to stay away from WebMD and instead think about um, what are facts that you can draw on from your experience and what are other sources of facts that you can lean on. So, for example, if you want to know why you have a headache, instead of going to WebMD, ask your doctor. Or think about what are the reasons you've had a headache before in the past, right? Instead of relying on WebMD or other websites like that, where your brain is just going to think about the worst case scenario and just hone in on those facts. Hopefully that helps. Um, let's move forward to the last slide, Daria.
Mhm.
Um, so I want everyone to share what's one thing that you learned today. And while you're sharing that, Daria, if you can put the next slide up. This is just my contact information. If you have questions, if you think you want some support, I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I specialize in working with people with anxiety every day, and licensed in almost all states, not every single one, but quite a majority. So feel free to reach out. I do have a lot more information on my website about anxiety. You can check out my Instagram or feel free to reach out via email. But thank you everyone for participating today. I'm so happy to be able to share these tips with you, and I hope everybody learned something helpful.
Ah, awesome, Whitley. Thank you so much. I know you have to run to catch another client, so thank you for being here. For everybody else, really appreciate you coming. If you've enjoyed these workshops and you want to see more of them, I've pasted a feedback survey in. They really do help. The more feedback we get about these, the more likely it is that we can keep hosting them. And then I've pasted Whitley's website in the chat as well. And then feel free to follow us on our newsletter or Instagram if you want to keep tabs on our upcoming workshops, which we've got a couple more coming down the pipeline. Thank you again. And we'll send out this recording in a newsletter, or sorry, in the newsletter, but also in a follow up email. So appreciate everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. Thank you. Hi. Take care. Thanks, folks.